There is a very particular moment in every relationship with a narcissist, a moment so quiet it almost goes unnoticed, yet powerful enough to shift the entire balance of power. It doesn't arrive through a dramatic fight or a bold declaration. Instead, it emerges softly, almost imperceptibly, often in the instant you look at them and, for the first time, truly see what lies behind the mask they've spent years constructing. And from that moment on, your mind begins to reconnect the fragments. The erratic behavior that once confused you suddenly makes sense. The alternating affection and coldness no longer feel mysterious. The insecurity and emptiness they hide beneath their manufactured confidence become clear, like a beam of light sweeping through a darkened room. Psychology calls this the collapse of the illusion, the point where your brain can no longer protect them with the familiar excuses you once made. What's striking is this: you haven't said a single word, yet your body, your gaze, your breath, all shift. You no longer respond according to the emotional cycles they rely on to control you. You no longer scramble to soothe them, no longer anticipate their moods, no longer shrink yourself just to keep the peace. And that subtle but profound change triggers their alarm instantly. Because, according to the psychological mechanisms typical of narcissism, they sense a loss of control even faster than you realize you've awakened. To most people, your change would look like growth, but to a narcissist, it is a red alert, a direct threat to the fragile structure of their identity. From the moment they sense you can see through them, the entire relational dynamic shifts. You are no longer a source of supply, no longer a reflective surface for their ego, no longer the safe container for their insecurities. You become the most dangerous thing to them, the bearer of truth. And to a narcissist, truth is not just uncomfortable, it is existentially terrifying. And it is from this exact point that a psychological war begins, one you never wanted, but one they must initiate to protect the illusion their survival depends on. First, to understand what really happens when you begin to see through a narcissist, we have to start with you, with the months and years you were exhausted from trying to decode them, the nights you blamed yourself for things you never actually did wrong, the feeling of living in a house where the entire atmosphere depended on their volatile moods. According to research by Dr. Jennifer Freyd at the University of Oregon, more than 60% of victims in toxic relationships experience a moment called a rupture of perception, a breaking point where the brain can no longer keep denying reality just to preserve a comforting illusion. When you reach that point, even if you do not say a single word, your eyes, your voice, and your breathing have already changed. It is a shift you do not consciously manufacture, but your body reacts as a last survival mechanism. However, what you experience as tired or burned out is interpreted by the narcissist as a threat to their very existence. Multiple personality studies by the American Psychological Association in the year 2020 show that people with high narcissistic traits react to loss of control up to 3 times more intensely than the average person. This means that the moment you stop responding in the usual way, they immediately sense a power slide. They notice you no longer rush to soothe them the moment they frown. You no longer lower your voice just to avoid upsetting them. You no longer scan every nuance of their mood to decide how you are allowed to live that day. It is as if you quietly unplugged a machine they assumed would run forever. And what terrifies them is not your silence itself, but the fact that they can no longer read you. At the same time, according to Dr. Ramani Durvasula, a leading researcher on narcissistic disorders, when the emotional supply begins to detach, the narcissist goes through a panic reaction similar to withdrawal in behavioral psychology. You can see this reaction in very ordinary moments. Dinner suddenly turns into an eye contact inspection. The question, "What did you do today?" is repeated with increasing suspicion. And even a simple sigh from you becomes a signal to them that their power is slipping. Suddenly, they monitor your schedule more closely, bombard you with questions, or, conversely, become strangely gentle and attentive. None of this is about love, it is about panic. Panic because they can feel something you have not yet put into words. You no longer belong to their emotional ecosystem. Ultimately, what you need to understand is this. For you, awakening is liberation, but for the narcissist, your awakening is a sentence. In their psychological structure, their ego exists only through other people's reactions to them. When you change, that ego starts to shake. When you detach, they lose their source of fuel. When you look straight at the mask, they experience a form of psychic threat, a deep attack on their sense of self. And from the moment this panic rises, the entire relationship moves into its most dangerous phase. They are compelled to claw back control at any cost, and you, whether you like it or not, become the target of a psychological war you were never prepared for. Once the moment of being seen through occurs, the narcissist's first internal reaction is not anger, it is ego collapse. In psychology, this is known as a narcissistic injury, a direct blow to the inflated self-image they have spent years constructing. They are used to living in a world where your gaze validates them, that they are intelligent, special, deserving of admiration. When that gaze stops believing, their nervous system does not interpret it as, "you're tired" or "you're changing," but as, "danger, I might be exposed." This reaction isn't intellectual, it's survival-based. Their heart rate rises, their body tightens, and the brain switches into emergency mode. Regain control immediately. It is an internal alarm triggered simply because you stopped reacting the way you used to. Next, to cope with this internal collapse, they begin tightening control at the micro-behavioral level. You will notice subtle shifts, more frequent questions like, "Where did you go today?" Messages such as, "Why are you replying so slow?" spoken with a half-joking, half-probing tone. Remarks like, "You've become distant lately," used like a small drill aimed at your guilt. On the surface, it can look like attentiveness or concern, but internally, it's a radar system, recalibrating your level of emotional dependency. They test how much you explain, how quickly you reassure, how deeply you still fear disappointing them. Every time you rush to soothe them, they mark it as still in control. Every time you respond calmly and briefly, the alarm in their chest grows louder. Simultaneously, because they cannot tolerate the possibility that they might be the problem, their mind must discharge that helplessness, and the easiest target is you. This is when projection and gaslighting intensify. Instead of acknowledging that you are withdrawing because you've been hurt, they tell themselves, and you, a different story. You're too sensitive. So they don't have to face their cruelty. You've been acting strange. Is something wrong with you mentally? So your clarity becomes a pathology. Clinical reports on personality disorders show that individuals with narcissistic structures cannot integrate the idea, "I hurt someone," into the conclusion, "I must take responsibility." Instead, they rely on defensive maneuvers to externalize blame and preserve the illusion. "I'm not the problem, you are." And finally, and this is the most devastating part, their entire internal panic gets handed back to you as emotional responsibility. You start hearing things like, "I feel like I'm not your priority anymore. If you loved me like before, you wouldn't be this cold." Here, not only is the narcissist in panic, you are now being pulled into it. Because you are conscientious, you begin asking yourself, "Am I really becoming distant? Am I being unfair? Am I ruining this?" And this is where their strategy becomes most dangerous. They make you believe that your awakening is the problem, that your clarity is unloving, unhealthy, or cruel. In other words, they are not only trying to regain external control, they are trying to reclaim the right to define your internal reality. If you look closely, you'll notice a paradox. The more they panic, the more they pretend everything is normal, the more terrified they are of losing you, the harder they try to convince you that you are the one losing everything. And this reversal, this distortion, is the clearest evidence of a deeper truth. Your awakening is not small at all. It is shaking the very psychological structure they depend on to exist. And then, when their initial panic fails to pull you back, the narcissist's nervous system shifts into a far more sophisticated strategy. Reclaiming control through tenderness. This is the stage where most victims become disoriented. because it does not look like warfare, it looks like love. In reality, it is the same power restoration mechanism described in research from the University of Missouri on coercive emotional behavior. When a person loses control over their target, they shift from threat to benevolence as a way to recondition the target's emotional responses. These changes arrive with surgical subtlety. Suddenly, they text more. They ask whether you slept well. They offer to cook your favorite meal. They bring up nostalgic memories in a strangely timed, almost theatrical way. But the true danger is not in their words, it is in their intent. They are not loving you, they are measuring you. They are testing whether a small dose of affection can pull you back into the role of emotional regulator that you once played so predictably. If your eyes soften, if your voice warms, if you respond with even a trace of tenderness, they register that as a signal. The door isn't closed yet. Masson, into S. Psychology calls this intermittent reinforcement the most addictive behavioral pattern in toxic relationships. What makes this phase so dangerous is that it doesn't resemble abuse at all. It resembles the revival of who they once pretended to be. And because of that, it strikes directly at your deepest longing, the longing that maybe, just maybe, they have finally changed. But examine its structure closely. Their affection appears only when you withdraw your emotional supply. The moment you soften, the tenderness evaporates. Their sweetness is not a state, it is a tool, activated only when their power weakens. You'll notice a familiar motif. They suddenly show insight. They say they understand your pain. They admit they were wrong. They talk about wanting to become better. Yet, as noted by researchers on personality disorders at King's College London, narcissists do not possess structural remorse, only strategic remorse. They feel sorry when their power is threatened, not when you are hurt. This means every "I miss you," "I'm sorry," or "we deserve another chance" is not an expression of emotion, it is an invitation to surrender your power. They do not want reconnection, they want a reset. They want you back in the psychological position where your emotional instability fed their emotional stability. When you believe in this gentle version of them, you unconsciously accept the premise that the problem was you, that if you just loved a little harder, tried a little more, tolerated a little longer, everything could return to harmony. This is the trap. You are being slowly guided back into your old role, without noticing you've been emotionally reconditioned. But the deepest truth is this: their sweetness is not love, it is fear. Fear of losing the mirror that reflects their fragile sense of self. Fear of losing the emotional bloodstream they depended on to regulate their inner chaos. Fear of losing the power they once held effortlessly over you. Their tenderness is a mask that appears only when their war fails. And when that mask no longer moves you, when your heart no longer reacts on cue, when your calm does not crumble under their affection, when the gestures that once swept you away now leave you unmoved, they realize that what they are losing is not you, but their power over you. That is the moment the next stage ignites, the shift from sweetness to rage. The most frightening thing is not the narcissist's anger, it is the moment it appears, because it only erupts when they realize that every sophisticated tool they've relied on, gentle manipulation, sentimental memories, unusual tenderness, no longer moves you. And in that moment, they understand something they never allowed themselves to imagine before. They have lost power over you. At this stage, their mind can no longer sustain its fabricated rational structure. According to analyses by psychologists who study cluster B personality disorders, a narcissist's rage is not a temporary emotion, it is a survival response. They are not angry because you did something wrong, they are angry because you reclaimed a sense of autonomy they believed belonged to them. You no longer waver, no longer justify, no longer melt at their apologies. And to them, this is not simply "you changed," it is you betraying the system they built to survive. This rage rises suddenly, cold as steel and sharp as a blade. It is nothing like normal human anger, which has a cause, a feeling, and a purpose. This is a form of primitive ego injury, a reaction described in multiple clinical studies. When the narcissistic self is threatened, Their nervous system triggers an aggressive response, equivalent to being cornered with no escape. You will see their fury unfold in 3 layers. First layer: the subtle, sugar-coated anger. A half-joking comment about how distant you seem. A question that digs into your emotions. A sarcastic remark laced with false compassion. It is as if they're punishing you while still trying to maintain the appearance of moral superiority. Second layer: the direct, eruptive anger. Their voice sharpens. Their eyes turn cold. They begin attacking your weak points with precision only someone you once trusted completely could possess. They dig up old wounds, pierce through insecurities you thought were buried, and make you feel as though you are the source of every problem. Third layer: the destructive rage. This is when you look at them and understand, this person is no longer trying to win an argument, they are trying to destroy you. They want you afraid. They want you small. They want your nervous system to remember the threat so that next time, you won't dare resist. Psychologists call this an extinction burst, the violent, final explosion of a controlling behavior when it is no longer being rewarded. For the narcissist, your lack of reaction means they are entering a state of psychological extinction, and before that extinction occurs, the behavior will erupt in its strongest, most unrestrained, most dangerous form. What makes this stage devastating is this: their rage aims directly at your soul, not at your actions, not at your mistakes, but at what you love most, cherish most, and feel most vulnerable about. They know exactly what could break you and they strike right there. But here is the paradox. The stronger their rage, the greater your inner freedom, because they only erupt with this level of violence when they sense their power dying. And in this furious, chaotic eruption, a truth they never wanted to face finally reveals itself. They no longer control you. And when rage no longer works, they move to the next phase, destroying your image in the eyes of the world. Because if they cannot control your mind, they will try to control your story. What's remarkable is this: their rage is not the ending, it's the announcement. Because once they realize that even their fury can no longer make you flinch, the narcissist shifts into the most destructive strategy in their entire psychological arsenal, destroying your reputation before the world can see the truth you now carry. For a narcissist, power doesn't live only in your mind, it lives in the perception of everyone around you. And when they lose the ability to control you internally, they pivot to controlling the external landscape around you. Psychologists refer to this as horizontal control. Instead of manipulating you directly, they manipulate the people standing around you. Their steps almost always follow the same sequence, as if the playbook was burned into their bones. First, they rewrite the story. A distorted, meticulously curated narrative, in which you, the one who suffered, suddenly become the unstable one. They whisper to mutual acquaintances with a wounded tone, "I've tried everything, but something is wrong with them." 9. It-headed it. It's not information, it's the planting of doubt. Second, they activate the false consensus effect. They tell person A that person B is concerned about you. They tell person B that person A has noticed you're acting strange. Neither of these things is true, but they manufacture the illusion that everyone sees the same thing. This tactic is documented in research from Princeton University on narcissistic social manipulation. Third, they invert reality. Every moment you reacted out of pain gets cut from its context and displayed as proof of your instability. Asterisk, you cried, they're overly emotional. Asterisk, you went silent, they're manipulative and withholding. Asterisk, you set boundaries, they've become controlling and toxic. Truth, stripped of context, becomes a weapon. Fourth, they become the victim. This is the most insidious phase. They sigh, they speak softly, they look heartbroken, they tell people they just want what's best for you. And this counterfeit vulnerability builds a social shield around them, a shield that leaves you isolated, even though you did nothing wrong. And here lies the most painful part. Sometimes the people you trust believe them before they believe you. Not because they are foolish or cruel, but because the narcissist's narrative offers something the human brain loves, a simple explanation for a complex reality. But beneath every smear strike lies a darker truth the narcissist will never admit. They must destroy your reputation because your clarity endangers their entire psychological structure. Your knowing gaze, your awakened perception, these things are lethal to a narcissist's fabricated self. And so, when they attack your reputation, they aren't merely trying to hurt you, they are trying to force the world to see you through their distorted lens. Because if they can no longer break you from the inside, they will attempt to break you from every vantage point outside. The most sophisticated part of the narcissist's reaction is not their rage, nor their smear campaign, it's the moment they come back wearing an entirely different face. Gentle, regretful, emotionally aware. If rage and smearing are open warfare, hoovering is the quiet negotiation, a last attempt to pull you back into their gravitational field before their power collapses completely. And because it looks like kindness, growth, and the person you fell in love with, this is the stage where even the most self-aware people can fall. In reality, hoovering does not begin in love, it begins in panic. In the earlier stages, you watched them attack your reality, your reputation, your nervous system, and yet you remained standing. When all the heavy weapons have been used and you still do not break, their narcissistic nervous system enters what behavioral psychology would describe as a post-extinction crisis. They realize that the old buttons, guilt, fear, shame, your longing to be understood, no longer produce the same reaction. And when they see that they cannot subdue you through fear, they reach for something they believe to be far more dangerous, your hope, not their hope, yours. Here, hoovering isn't just late-night texts saying, "I miss you," or "You're the only one who really gets me." Psychologically, it is a carefully designed activation packet meant to reawaken the entire trauma bond they built inside you. The beautiful memories from the idealization phase, the late-night talks, the feeling of finally being seen, the intensity that once felt like destiny, become data they now redeploy. They are not randomly remembering the good times. They are choosing the exact memories that used to soften you, that used to make you doubt your own clarity. And when they say, "I finally see what I did wrong, I've grown, I've changed," what they are really testing is not whether they deserve a second chance, but whether your nervous system still responds to them the way it used to. The cruelty of hoovering lies in its target. It does not attack your weakest wound. It attacks the best parts of you. Your compassion, your capacity for forgiveness, your belief that people can change, your fear of being too cold, too harsh, your anxiety about becoming the kind of person who gives up on others. Your brain, long conditioned by cycles of devaluation, tension, temporary relief, starts to tremble. Every apology, every gentle message, every "I'm lost without you" functions like a variable reward, something behavioral studies have shown to be one of the most addictive reinforcement patterns. You are not addicted to them, you are addicted to the moment they finally stop hurting you and temporarily act like the person you needed them to be all along. Hoovering is the attempt to switch that addiction back on. On their side of the equation, hoovering is the ego's final exam. If a few messages, a few nostalgic callbacks, a few vague promises are enough to soften you, they exhale in relief. The power structure remains. You are still recallable supply. They can adjust their tactics, act better for a while, wear a more polished mask, but deep down they know they have proven one critical thing. Under the right emotional conditions, you will still return to your old role. If, however, you remain distant, responding briefly, neutrally, or not at all, the hoover begins to mutate. "I miss you so much" subtly morphs into "You've changed, you're so cold now." "I was wrong" quietly shifts into "You weren't perfect either." Sweetness curdles into veiled blame. That is the moment you see it clearly. This was never repentance. It was a power test. The most important truth at this stage is this: they do not miss you as the person you are becoming. They miss the version of you that existed before you woke up. They miss the one who stayed after every insult, the one who picked up the shards when they were the one who smashed the glass. The one who believed that if they just loved a little harder, tolerated a little more, carried a little more of the weight, everything would eventually heal. Hoovering does not call to your awakened self. It calls to the part of you that once sacrificed your own sanity to keep the relationship alive. So, if you feel yourself pulled in two directions, softer and angrier, nostalgic and nauseated, tempted and repulsed, that is not weakness. That is the biological echo of a nervous system once trained to confuse abuse with attachment. The paradox is this. The moment you look directly at the Hoover and name it, this is not love, this is strategy, your inner power crystallizes. You do not need to respond with cruelty. You do not need to defend yourself. You do not need to prove anything. You simply refuse to step back into the script. Hoovering only works if you engage. When you don't return, don't explain, don't step back into the old dance, the Hoover fails. And, when the Hoover fails, a truth the narcissistic ego has spent its entire existence avoiding becomes undeniable. All paths back into your mind are closed. From that point on, they are left with only two options: seek a new source of supply, or descend into the narcissistic collapse they fear more than anything else. What most people never talk about is this: when hoovering fails, it's not only the narcissist who spirals, you also begin to change in a profoundly quiet and deeply internal way. This is not instant healing or the triumph people imagine. It is a period of internal reorganization, a restructuring of your nervous system and identity after years of emotional conditioning. First, understand this. Throughout the relationship, your nervous system was programmed to respond to them. Their sigh elevated your cortisol. Their text increased your heart rate. Their silence, their tone, their passive-aggressive expressions all forced you to calibrate your behavior. Throughout that time, you weren't merely trying to keep the peace. You were trying to survive. When you reach the phase of not reacting, what truly happens is this: your brain begins disconnecting them from its survival circuitry. Neuroscientists call this neural decoupling. The neural pathways that once triggered automatic appeasement or panic begin to dissolve. This isn't just you being stronger, it is your brain rebuilding itself. But here is the part almost no one understands. When your brain stops reacting to them, it forces you to confront yourself. Without chaos, without emotional whiplash, without apologies that break you open, you are finally left alone with the questions you never had the bandwidth to ask. Why did I tolerate that for so long? Why did I confuse intensity with love? Why does peace feel unfamiliar? This is not self-blame, this is awakening. For the first time in years, your nervous system has enough space to feel you, your fears, your hopes, your desires, your long-buried self-respect. From here, a powerful psychological phenomenon emerges: post-traumatic clarity, the clarity that arrives after prolonged emotional trauma. It is the moment you look at the relationship not with the eyes of someone in love, but with the eyes of someone who has survived it. You begin to see. You didn't love them. You loved the moments they stopped hurting you. You loved the hope that they might become who they pretended to be in the beginning. You loved the illusion crafted to bind you to them. The most painful revelation is realizing you weren't attached to who they were, but to the promise they never planned to keep. And when this truth reaches the deepest parts of you, a quiet rebirth begins. You no longer want to return, not because they're worse, but because you've become different. This is the turning point the narcissist never anticipates. In their worldview, there are only two possibilities. You belong to them, or you belong to someone else. They cannot comprehend a third possibility. You can belong to yourself, and the moment you do, their collapse truly begins. And when every tactic fails, when you no longer react, no longer soften, no longer return to the familiar cycles, the narcissist enters the stage. They fear more than anything else the collapse of the false self. This is not the collapse of a relationship. It is the collapse of the psychological architecture they have built to outrun their deepest shame. Imagine their ego structure as a skyscraper built on sand, standing only because of three pillars: manipulation, control, and the reflection they extract from you. When all three pillars crumble, what remains is not a person rediscovering themselves, but a void they have avoided their entire life. The first sign of collapse is emotional disorientation. This is not sadness. It is the psychological equivalent of a system crash. Clinicians call it identity diffusion, a state in which the narcissist can no longer define who they are without you acting as their mirror. You were the stabilizer of their emotional chaos. You were the narrative they used to feel important. You were the ecosystem that kept their grandiosity alive. When you step out, their identity begins to dissolve. Then comes behavioral depletion. The once loud, confident, dominating presence becomes withdrawn, erratic, or strangely vacant. This is not remorse. This is not awakening. This is the aftermath of losing their only psychological fuel source. Some call it karma. Psychology calls it narcissistic mortification, the catastrophic shame experienced when the false self is stripped bare. They feel empty. They feel worthless. They feel exposed in a way they cannot tolerate. And this is the moment you see something you never expected. Beneath all the arrogance lies a profoundly fragile psyche. Not fragile in a soft, sympathetic sense, but fragile in the sense that it cannot exist without external scaffolding. They are not collapsing because they lost you. They are collapsing because they lost the psychological infrastructure you unknowingly upheld. Yet even in collapse, they do not learn. They do not evolve. They seek new supply, new admirers, new emotional hosts to reconstruct the illusion that has just disintegrated. But for you, this moment becomes irreversible clarity. The collapse shows you everything. The emptiness behind the charm, the dependency behind the dominance, the child behind the monster. You do not leave because they are bad. You leave because you have outgrown the illusion. And in that moment, your power returns to where it always belonged, back to you. When you step back and look at the entire journey from the moment you first saw through them, to their attacks on your perception, their sweet manipulation, their volcanic rage, the smear campaign, and the desperate hoover, you'll recognize one recurring truth. Nothing they did ever reflected your worth. Every reaction was simply the meltdown of a person terrified of losing control. This entire script walked you through the psychological mechanisms behind their behavior, so you could finally see that their cruelty was never evidence of your inadequacy, but evidence of their inability to love in a stable or healthy way. And here is the deeper truth. The moment you awakened, you did something they have never been able to do: face reality. You identified the power games, recognized the manipulation cycles, understood how they target your emotions, and saw the ego collapse behind their rage. You also saw the hoover for what it truly is: not longing, but panic, not love, but withdrawal. And you now understand that each behavior belongs to the architecture of a personality disorder, not the architecture of your identity. So, what should you take with you? If you are currently with a narcissist, watch their patterns, not their promises. If you are entering a new relationship, remember that excessive sweetness in the beginning may be a warning sign, not a miracle. And if you have left, do not return out of temporary loneliness, because you are returning to an ecosystem designed to make you forget your own worth. Your freedom begins with awareness, grows through boundaries, and flourishes when you stop trying to fix someone who was never trying to change. This journey is not about understanding them, it is about recovering yourself.